You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 49. Karyne waited for the flash of searing pain, expecting to be engulfed like the memories he'd experienced on Islara's streets. A rush of air brushed over his back, ruffling his clothes and hair, but the heat didn't come. He became aware of the soft body beneath him, the short breaths in his ear, his arms wrapped around Daisy's neck, pulling her into his chest. Heat rose to his cheeks, and he released his grip, leaning to the side to give Daisy space to scoot out from under him. Her eyes narrowed as she stood and brushed off her blouse and skirt. The men around them still watched the skies, wary for the dragon's return, but the beast was long gone, and only the stars still darted through the sky. "You let him go." His statement came out defeated. He'd meant to ask why, but the absurdity of it all left his tongue tied. His heart still thudded at their dance with death, and his head still swam over the fit of Daisy in his arms. The mark on his palm itched. "He wasn't mine to hold back." She reached down to grab his dagger. Karyne couldn't stop the scoff from rising in his throat. He was a murderer. He was a pawn, played by Mavis. Her words took on a dangerous tone even as she held the dagger out for him. If she'd been Enla, Karyne might have been smart enough to shut his mouth, but she wasn't Enla. She was supposed to be his little Daisy, but she wasn't her either. He grabbed the dagger, shoving it in his belt. He raised this entire town. He killed thousands. He swept his arm out, forcing her to take in their destitute surroundings. His throat grew tight as the people's memories flooded through him again. "I felt them die. He'll kill again, but this time you'll have played a role in it." Something flickered on Daisy's face, but too quickly her face became passive once more, every part of her remaining a mystery. For all he knew, she'd used blood magic to keep the dragon at bay. The man who had guarded her earlier came to her side, gently checking her over for injuries, but she ignored him, even brushed him aside to refocus her glare on Karyne. "Kendallin says you're coming with us." "Why?" He opened his mouth, ready with his automatic response. He had vowed to protect her, but watching Daisy face a dragon and live, hearing her scold him for wanting the dragon dead, her power was beyond anything he'd seen, and he'd been a fool to think she ever needed his protection. His promise now felt childish. Even showing her memories of their childhood would seem like a pathetic attempt to sway her. And what were his memories? The leftover pain of an 8-year-old boy who'd watched a toddler get taken. Those memories would mean little to her now that they were adults. But he couldn't just walk away. He finally had proof that Mavis was the enemy he'd believed her to be. As long as they were against Mavis, he would fight with them. "I want to stop Mavis," he said. Daisy held his gaze as the others around them gathered their weapons, their eyes still glancing toward the sky. Silmar hobbled between Karyne and Daisy, taking in their standoff. "Do you have armies to help us?" Daisy asked. "Maybe," he lied. She rolled her eyes and turned to the other man, slapping his hand away from her arm. "I'm fine. It's just a scratch." Then she turned to Silmar, effectively dismissing both Karyne and her guardian. "Will Mavis know we removed his brand?" Silmar nodded, also turning his back on Karyne, whose mouth swung open. Even in Enla's meetings, when she held everyone's attention, he was never ignored. "So on top of knowing we were headed this way, She now knows we've arrived? Daisy crossed her arms over her chest with a frown. Is it still safe to use the pass? It was never safe. Silmar's gravelly words were barely decipherable. But is it even realistic? Silmar hesitated, and Karyne found his in. I have a ship, he blurted out. The others turned his way, the surprise on their faces almost insulting, like they'd already forgotten he was there. We could take the road to L&S and board my ship to sail across the northern sea, right up to Mavis's back door. Daisy stepped around Silmar, her eyes finally alight with interest. If nothing else, he kept talking to see the green gleam he'd been envisioning all these years. While we're there, I might be able to convince my sister to send troops with us. She won't stand for Mavis's attack on an innocent town. You're offering a potential fleet to go after Mavis? Silmar's voice rose, his face as angry as ever. Somehow, Karyne suspected he was more interested than irritated. I can guarantee safe passage for 8 to 10 of you. And yes, maybe a small fleet. He was even starting to convince himself. His parents and Enla couldn't ignore what had happened. Mavis had led a direct attack on a city in their kingdom. It couldn't go unpunished. And what about the warrant for Aeliana's arrest? Silmar asked. Karyne shrugged. I'll find out what it's for. But my family doesn't need to know she's involved. They'll be responding to an attack on the city of Islara. That's all. What's in it for you? Silmar asked. Protection from Mavis is what's best for the people of L&S, for all of Vendaris. Our goals align. Karyne cocked his head, aware that his motivation sounded too noble for their opinion of him. I'll want the Starbridges too. Daisy let out a huff and muttered something under her breath. Karyne smiled and shrugged. Being an ambassador instead of a throne warden still sounded good, but he was starting to wonder if the better plan was to collect them all for Aura, to see why she needed all 4. But he was fine letting the others think he was on another silly treasure hunt. Daisy's guardian slipped his hand in hers. Karen's breath hitched as he saw their matching blood-red marks slide together like a puzzle, the squeezing motion of their hands directly transferring to his chest. The man was her bondmate, then. It shouldn't have surprised Karyne. He'd seen the mark of a bond back when she was a toddler. His own mark itched again, and he rubbed at it in irritation. When you use the golden arrow to go to Lorvandas, Daisy said, I want you to take Cyrus with you. Karyne raised his eyebrows, glancing at her bondmate. Not me, the man said. The human she brought over with her. Long red hair, priest's garb. Karyne glanced back toward their camp, even though he couldn't see the man they spoke of from this distance, the one who'd practically worshipped Aura. Did humans worship the stars like witches? You want me to take him back? Safely. Daisy's response came out like a warning, and it stung. It appeared she trusted him as little as he now trusted her. You have my word. Can we make it there by summer solstice? Daisy turned to Silmar. Why? What happens on summer solstice? Karyne asked. Silmar's glare bore into Karyne over Daisy's shoulder. Nothing. Karyne swore he heard the old man mutter, If we can help it. We should be able to, Daisy's bondmate said. If Karyne already has a ship available to take to the Northern Sea, we won't have to waste time finding a captain willing to take us. Daisy didn't look convinced, but she nodded her understanding. By now, the rest of the group had cleared out from Islara's wasteland. Weariness swept over Karyne as the events of the day caught up to him. His exhaustion reflected back to him from Silmar's and Daisy's long faces. We'll rest tonight, Silmar said, leaning hard on his staff and heading for the gate. Tomorrow Karyne will lead the way. Daisy and her bondmate followed Silmar without another glance at Karyne. Everything he'd been so sure about before entering this city was now uncertain. He'd found Daisy, but she didn't remember him. She didn't even like him. She was a Windren, the sworn enemy of his family line, and she did blood magic. He couldn't support any of the things she stood behind. So where did that leave Karyne? Giving up the goal he'd had for the last 14 years felt like a betrayal of himself, of Daisy. But this woman wasn't really Daisy. She was Eliana Windren, and he needed to remember that. He followed Daisy's footsteps, knowing that as much as the events of the day should change things, they didn't. Not exactly. He would still fight to protect his people from Mavis's impending rule. He would still seek out the star bridges. He would even still watch over Daisy, partly because he couldn't quite let go of the habit, but also because somehow, enemy or not, she was key to both of those goals. Besides, if she was going to keep making terrible decisions, like freeing deadly dragons, she needed someone looking out for her. If anything, now he needed to protect her from herself.
Chapter 50. Aura lay awake, listening to the sounds of the others sleeping around her. Eliana and Karyne were both restless on their opposite sides of the camp. Lukai shared their agitation, as if it carried through his bond. Perhaps it did. She rubbed the space on her palm, where her bonds had once been, the memories of the attachments like a phantom pain. She'd sensed her bonds' sharpest pains and regrets, along with their deepest hopes. Today's events might have carried that same weight for these people and their bonds. The braid at her wrist twinged with its own longing, reminding her of her primary purpose. The star bridge wasn't here. The disappointment burned deep in her gut. They'd been scattered throughout Riston for the last 1,000 years. What made her think she'd gather them within a few short moons? Still, she felt she was on the right path. Eliana needed her, and it seemed as if the arrow's absence allowed Aura to continue pursuing it while helping Eliana. It reminded her of the days when she'd walked in the sun's blessing. Aura rose from her bedroll and made her way to the edge of camp. As she passed Cyrus, she sensed his dreams still plaguing him, with his grandmother's death. She bent down and placed 2 fingers on his temple, smoothing the sharp edges of his dreams, like blending water with light to allow joy to seep in. He sighed in his sleep and turned, the lifted burden making Aura feel lighter too, even as her draining power weighed her down. She paused at the forest line, exactly between the 2 sentries on either side of the camp. They each glanced at her in turn, but made no motion to stop her, especially when they caught sight of Silmar joining her. "You knew I'd come," he said. "I suspected." She didn't bother looking at him, but smiled as she gazed out over the lost city. "Kendallin couldn't sift through your soul." "No half-light can. But you knew that before you sent her to me." "I suspected." His tone remained light, and for a moment, Aura allowed herself to think of him as a teasing friend. The silence between them lengthened until flashes of light popped in the sky, shooting down to the earth like meteors. Silmar held up a hand, shielding his face, But Aura kept her eyes open until they watered, breathing in the sight of the stars coming down to honor the dead progenies and take back their starlocks. The sentries called out in their excitement, waking most of the others to watch. The lights came and went in such vast numbers, the broken city illuminated like it was filled once more. Until suddenly, all the starlocks were gone, and with them all the stars. Tears streamed down Aura's face, the loss of their presence too deep to ignore. The others settled back in camp, still murmuring over the shock of such a sight, speculating over how many progenies had died by Durakin's fire.
I know who you are.
Silmar shifted closer, as if daring her to look him in the eye.
I know what you did. The others might think you're too holy to lead us astray, but I know how selfish you truly are.
Aura's smile faded, and she blinked up at the stars. The pain of watching their dance from the earth, a welcome feeling. A grounding sensation. Few have recognized me over the years. It takes someone who pays attention, someone who knows what to look for and when. His laugh came out harsh.
Don't expect me to be flattered. I won't forget your mistakes, no matter how much you pretend to help us.
I would think less of you if you did. She finally turned, watching him closely. A flicker of fear crossed his face, and he tightened his grip on his staff. She didn't want his fear, but she appreciated his vigilance. It would serve their mission well. Even so, she said, you don't know the whole story. So often we acknowledge that good intentions can be the difference between an action being right and wrong. But sometimes good intentions can lead to action that still has negative consequences. Someday my sins will be revealed to all, along with the sun's glory. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The time is soon. She turned back, her focus resting on Eliana. Silmar shifted, following her line of vision.
You leave the girl out of your mischief.
His words came out low, in warning. When she didn't respond right away, he straightened.
Did you hear me?
Aura nodded, even though she couldn't make promises. I made my choices long ago. I have to bear the consequences. She twisted the braid at her wrist. Eliana will have her own choices to make. Chapter 51. Who do you think will stop glaring at me first? Eliana asked. Silmar or Karyne? Cyrus grinned from beside her, his teeth flashing in the sliver of moonlight. After one day back on the road, they'd gotten stuck with night watch, and Eliana was glad. The day had been a strained, silent one, everyone too wary to say anything they shouldn't. Now she and Cyrus still sat mostly in silence, but it was a peaceful one, with the fire crackling and Holm softly snoring. This far from Islara, the forest no longer carried the scent of smoke, but Eliana could still smell it on her clothes, like the ashes of the city's residents clung to her skin and stained the fabric. "I think most everyone has glared at you today," Cyrus said, "except for maybe Aura and me." She made a face, knowing he was right. Her desire to free Durakin hadn't been a popular one, which wasn't fair, considering cutting out his brand had ended up being their only option anyway. She thought about sharing the memories Durakin had shown her as proof that she'd made the right choice, but she feared confirming the dragon's magic would only fuel people's insistence that he was too dangerous to have let live. Karyne even gained some ground with the recreants when word got around that he'd tried to slay Durakin. "Do you think his story is true?" she asked. "Whose? Karyne's?" He shrugged. "Kendallin tested him, and Iris vouched for his past. What does he have to gain by lying?" Eliana bit her lip. Access to her mother? Inside information on the recreants? Silmar, Velden, and Jasperus had held a hushed meeting after dinner, instead of discussing their plans with everyone at the fire like usual. The caution didn't surprise her. If anything, she wondered why they hadn't been doing that from the beginning, knowing that at any point she could be branded and under Mavis's control. But it still left her confused. Karyne was arrogant and foolhardy, but he hadn't shown any signs of being a danger to her or their mission to save her mother. Karyne had ridden into Islara to save her from a dragon. He'd shielded her with his body when he anticipated Durakin's fire. And his words about their childhood stirred up that same longing she'd had for home. Like he was the tie she'd been looking for to her past. What if she asked to see his memories? She ran her finger over the fresh scabs and bruises lining her arms. She couldn't remember getting them, but a lot had happened in Islara. She tapped into her Starlock's power, letting it feed her magic as she healed them one by one. "Has your magic replenished?" Cyrus asked. She shook her head. "Not completely. Silmar said it could take a few days. It's why they use their magic so rarely." "I would have liked to see your shield." She smiled. She was eager to try it again, too. You know, slicing Durakin's other wing was both wildly brave and stupid. He grinned. "I couldn't let you always be the one to save the day." She snorted. "I never save the day." "I thought I was going to die when I did that." He shook his head, his gaze unfocused, likely reliving the moment. "But I was more worried that you would." Eliana's throat grew tight. "You know you've already fulfilled your vow to your grandma 12 times over." He smiled. "I didn't protect you because Gams told me to. I'm not even sure I protected you because of how important you're supposed to be to the Vendarans. Maybe that should be my motivation. It sounds more like a mission from the stars. But it's more instinctual than that. More simple. You're my friend, and I care about what happens to you." Eliana didn't trust herself to speak, so she reached out and squeezed his hand in thanks. Cyrus leaned back, angling behind her to see deeper into the woods. A line of leather stuck out from his collar, and she tapped it. "What's that?" He sat up, placing a hand over his neck. "Nothing. It's just, the last time we stopped in a town for supplies, I noticed people treating the progenies differently. I thought it would be good for me to have a fake starlock." She grinned. "That's actually brilliant." "You think so?" He beamed at her. "What did you pick for the charm?" His hand went back to his neck. "Just a thing. Something to weigh it down." She let him awkwardly avoid her eyes for a bit longer before letting out a snort. "You're a terrible liar. But I guess that makes you an excellent priest." He frowned, glancing back at the lumps of blankets containing their friends. "Do you think an excellent priest would want to read a copy of The Sins of the Stars?" Eliana followed his gaze. "You saw Karyne reading it when we stopped for lunch, didn't you?" He nodded, his face clouded with shame. "I think an excellent priest would do his best to learn as much as he can, even about teaching that could be blasphemous." She nudged him with her elbow, and he smiled faintly. Then he would compare it to all the things he knows to be true about the stars. Weigh the information out and ask the stars for guidance. He nodded and opened his mouth. But then his focus darted beyond her, his eyes squinting as his muscles tensed. "Are those—" Eliana turned around, expecting nothing but darkness. Instead, silvery figures crept out from the brush dividing the road from their camp. Eliana reached for her bow. Tomorrow was the new moon. Surely these dying Winnicks weren't reckless enough to stage an attack now. Eliana jumped to her feet, pulling an arrow from her quiver, while Cyrus unsheathed his sword. She tried to remember Veldon's instructions. Winnicks had weak joints, so she should go for the knees. But if it came down to it, neither of their close combat skills had improved enough for a fight. "Silmar, Veldon, Lukai!" Eliana shouted. She didn't need stealth like the Winnicks. She counted 10 of them, but even if they'd had 20, it wouldn't have been a fair fight in the creature's emaciated condition. The others rose from their bedrolls, barely grabbing their weapons before the Winnicks were upon them. 2 of the Winnicks brandished sticks, and Eliana gawked as they went after Silmar and Veldon, who batted them away like flies. 2 more were met by Kendallin's and Jasperus's swords. Unfortunately, the 2 who had actual swords and seemed to know how to use them came for Eliana and Cyrus. Eliana struggled to pull out her heavy dagger, barely managing to hold it out and block the Winnicks's thrust. Her dagger was no match for a sword, and the momentum pushed her to the ground. Before the Winnicks could thrust again, Karyne was standing between them, blocking the attack and countering it with his sword. With his and Riveren's help, the 2 strongest fighters went down fast. 3 others went straight for the packs, digging for food, but Holm and Iris were waiting, the slice of their daggers mercifully quick. Aura stood off to the side, eyes closed and brow pinched, as if mentally warding off the intruders. The fight was nearly over before it began, but the final Winix raised his arm over Lukai, the glint of metal making Eliana finally take aim and loose an arrow. The surge of energy in her blood made her aim true, but she pierced the creature's arm instead of his heart, making him drop the weapon and stumble. Eliana ran forward just as Lukai knocked the Winix to the ground. His sword lined up to plummet through the creature's chest. "Wait!" Eliana's cry startled Lukai, staying his sword. "His cheek. Look at his left cheek." The others gathered around too, while the Winix mewed pitifully. He scratched at the arrow in his arm, too weak or scared to pull it free. His big, mournful eyes studied them all as he squirmed, far too aware of his fate. In the center of his left cheek, a black mark stood out against his silver skin, a tear-shaped scar. "Felk?" Eliana asked. The creature froze, then cocked his head at her. "You know me?" Silmar growled and lumbered closer. "He's been following us all this time." He whipped out his knife, but Eliana blocked him with her body. "How do you remember your name?" she asked the Winix. "We always know our names. It's written in our minds, like breathing or scavenging for food. We can't forget the things of survival." Felk shifted warily, taking a step away. Lukai grabbed the Winix's injured arm before he could bolt, and the creature let out a howl. Eliana frowned. She hadn't anticipated the scar transferring across his rebirth. So their bodies weren't entirely new, even if their minds didn't hold their memories. "We need to kill him," Silmar said. Eliana frowned. "Tomorrow is a new moon." She studied the Winix as he studied her back. "Doesn't that mean he'll die tonight anyway?" "It means he'll be reborn tomorrow," Veldin corrected, "with the sun's morn." "But he won't remember us?" Eliana asked. Veldin hesitated, glancing at Silmar. "He followed us once already," Silmar said. "Do you want to take the risk? For all we know, there are dozens of eggs planted between Valorian and here. We don't need an army at our front and another at our back." "He had fewer Winix with him than the last time he attacked," Eliana said. "And clearly these weren't a problem. He doesn't seem like much of a threat." "Things might have gone differently if the moon were full," Silmar said. "Might have." Felk's eyes squeezed shut, and he threw his head back in that all-too-familiar laugh, a tinkling sound like a wind chime. It left everyone in the group momentarily stunned. Eliana's mind felt fuzzy, and her actions slowed. Felk used the distraction to bolt away from Lukai, but Holm and Jasperus each grabbed an arm, holding him back despite his even louder howls. "What was that?" Cyrus asked. "A laugh," Silmar said. "They often use it to reel in their prey." "Let's tie him up," Eliana suggested. "Let him loose in the morning." "Whatever for?" Silmar huffed out, then stalked off toward his bedroll, mumbling under his breath. "It does seem unwise," Veldin said, rubbing his webbed hand over the back of his head. I'm curious about their transition, Eliana said. Cyrus's eyes lit up with his agreement. I'd like to watch it, and as a newborn, he won't be a threat to us. Felk's tongue slipped out from between his rows of teeth to swipe across his lip. I might not even survive. His interest in her plan probably confirmed it was a bad one. Maybe we'll make sure you don't survive, Lukai muttered, following Silmar. The others slowly dispersed as well, not bothering to hide their disapproval. Jasperus and Holm forced Felk to the ground before tying his hands and feet. First the dragon, now a Winix. Kendallin shook her head. Karyne and Riverin stayed, the faithful friend taking his cue from the prince. Is he a threat to your crown, too? Eliana asked, unable to stand the judgmental silence. Karyne ignored her question, holding out her dagger, grip first. This is a terrible weapon for you. You need something light, with a sharper edge. She yanked it from his hand and shoved it in her belt, nearly missing its sheath. Karyne smirked, the laughter in his eyes far more condemning than his earlier silence and stares. He turned back to his bedroll, and Riverin followed. At the edge of the group, Aura stood, a serene smile on her face. She gave the slightest nod to Eliana, before finding her bedroll as well. I bet they've all done it once in their life, Cyrus said quietly. He and Eliana remained, watching the Winix squirm. Done what? She asked. Caught a Winix before a new moon, and watched it be reborn. It's probably a rite of passage as a child here. Eliana smiled, then pulled out some dried meat, offering it to Felk. Wait, that was supposed to be our snack. Cyrus glared at Eliana, snatching the remaining meat from her hand. Felk grinned as he chewed, his eyes closed to mere slits. They dragged Felk to their original lookout, watching for more intruders, while also watching for his transition. As the night wore on, Felk grew more still, his breathing turning shallow. Even his skin turned an ashy gray instead of silver. Are you sure he's not dying? Cyrus asked, nudging Felk with his boot. Felk no longer moved, and Eliana couldn't be sure he still breathed. Maybe it was the arrow in his arm. She bit her lip. She should have healed it, but she'd been worried it would make him too strong. Exhaustion seeped in as Eliana realized in their desperation to see Felk's transition, they'd never woken the third watch. The others stirred around camp. Kendallin rebuilt the fire, and Holm began packing supplies. Lukai led the horses to a new place to graze while they prepared to move out. The sun peeked over the horizon, and Eliana started when Cyrus hissed her name. When she turned to look again, Felk's ashy skin looked mottled, and flecks of it blew away in the morning breeze. In moments, his entire body had dissolved to dust, the remnants of him floating away on the wind, except for a tiny figure left where his ribs had once been, half covered by the rags that had kept Felk somewhat modest, or maybe just warm. A tiny yawn rose from the fabric, followed by a mewling noise, making Eliana's breath hitch. She stepped forward, adjusting the fabric to see those same mournful eyes looking up at her, the single tear marking Felk's left cheek. He blinked, and his lip quivered, revealing a mouth empty of the ferocious teeth he'd had moments before. Tiny hands balled into fists, and silvery legs poked out through the rags as he kicked. Eliana squeezed her eyes shut, wanting to block out the pitiful sight. But it couldn't be unseen. "No, Eliana," Cyrus warned, even as her hands reached for the bundle. She picked Felk up, adjusting the rags tighter around his small form until he was snuggled between her arm and chest. She reached for her water flask and tipped it up to the tiny creature's parted mouth. "You can't possibly bring him with us." "He'll die if we leave him." Eliana set her jaw, refusing to look at Cyrus. She stared at Felk, who studied her between slow blinks. "It's their way," Cyrus said, but his words no longer held conviction. He leaned forward, reaching for Felk's tiny fist, which relaxed just enough to grasp Cyrus's finger instead. "By tomorrow, he'll be a toddler. At the end of the week, he'll almost be full grown." "He won't stay with us that long. Just a couple of days at most, until he can take care of himself." Cyrus snorted, startling Felk into a cry. Eliana hushed him, then stroked his face and cheek until his eyes slid shut once more, and his mouth twitched into a gummy smile. Eliana smiled in return, but Cyrus backed away, shaking his head. "Silmar is going to kill you." I hope you enjoyed listening to this first installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. To get reminders for new episodes and to stay up to date with my books, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at KarynNorton.com. You'll also get the prequel short story to Blood of the Stars in ebook and audio for free. Thanks so much for listening.